The Tom Woods Show, episode 1932.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, don't even think about missing the libertarian event of the year, the 2000th episode of The Tom Woods Show, live in Orlando, featuring many of your favorites from The Tom Woods Show. And Michael Malice says his special surprise guest, whose identity I myself don't even know, will bring the house down. Cost nothing to attend. Register at tomwoods2000.com. Hey folks, Tom Woods here. A couple things to tell you before we get started with our episode. First, the topic for today is the national debt, and in particular, whether it really does any harm to us or not. Now, of course, we know it does, but we want to talk about exactly what forms that harm takes, because sometimes they're not that evident. And to talk to us about this, we have our old friend Gene Epstein, who is the director of the Soho Forum, which is the premier libertarian debate series in the country. And before that, he served as economics and book review editor at Barron's, the nation's premier financial publication. And before that, he was chief economist at the New York Stock Exchange. He's got a resume as long as my arm. But I'm glad that right now his job consists of sitting here and talking to us about the national debt. So we're going to bring Gene on in a minute. Before we do that, I want to let you in on something one of my listeners has done that I think some of you folks will find interesting. And he's created a website and a service, privatephoneShop.com. And so the way he pitches it is, whether it's censoring dissident voices or restricting what you can say about COVID, it's clear that big tech companies are no friend to libertarians. Why support them by carrying a phone that spies on you just so they can sell your data? At Private Phone Shop, we sell de-Googled phones free from tracking and spyware, plus advice on what apps to use in order to protect your privacy. And if you use promo code WOODS, get a free power bank with the purchase of any phone. So check that out at privatephoneShop.com. I'll link to it on the show notes page. That's tomwoods.com/1932. And of course, this company used my link to get their hosting. So they get a boost from me and some other great goodies to give them a nice unfair advantage, let's say, out of the gate. So if you'd like to have that for a site you're thinking of creating, check out tomwoods.com/publicity before you create that site, and you will be in the driver's seat. All right, now over to Gene Epstein. Now, let me warn you. Don't say I didn't warn you. When Gene and I talk, sometimes it takes a little while to get going, but it's always worth listening to, okay? Even the banter is always worth listening to. Gene, welcome to the show.
Tom, it's great to be back on your show. And of course, it was great to see you at PorcFest just a week or so ago. And in fact, coincidentally, perhaps you missed the barn burner of a lecture by one of my favorite living economists, Bob Murphy, at PorcFest, because he delivered quite an intense lecture on the subject that you and I are going to discuss this morning, much of it devoted to that issue of the burgeoning debt and the alarms about it. And so I'm going to crib a little bit from the great Bob.
That's good. Bob just seems so busy lately that I feel bad asking him to come on the poor Tom Woods Show. But I know I got old Gene Epstein anytime I want.
Yeah, that's right. You can always fall back on me, and then I guess also I really appreciate your recent update on the reopenings, and from ground zero in New York City. Of course, we are seeing the city come alive. Although the various venues that we're talking to are dragging their heels, like the New School or other places, they're not quite making their plans. And I'm very eager to get the Soho Forum back at a regular home. We have only one solid commitment, which is symphony space for the long-awaited Bill Kristol versus Scott Horton debate on October 4th. And I know you've told me, Tom, that October is too difficult a month for you to make it to New York City, so you'll be missed. Although the good news is that Symphony Space does have a pretty significant space for a party and a bar afterwards. So I can indeed continue that great tradition of offering a free drink at the bar to anybody who says Tom Woods to me. That's October 4th. And we're nearly, we've got about 50 tickets left before we declare sellout on that one. And that's going to be about 760 people attending. So that's our big event. And we're happy about it. But I want to launch for September another debate. And we're still trying to get these venues to open up and make a commitment significant to us. We lost our home at the Subculture Theater, another sort of casualty of the lockdowns, which is much to be regretted. But we're assiduously looking around, and we'll keep people updated. Meanwhile, go into the Soul Forum Debates podcast for all our debates, including the one of mine that recently exceeded 2.5 million YouTube views. And that's another puzzle for me, just as Michael Malice can't quite figure out how his collection of essays on anarchism did so well. I can't quite figure out on a lesser level how I'm now exceeding 2.5 million YouTube views with that one socialism debate. But that's where we stand. And I guess we should get things launched, Tom, on the subject of the day.
Yes, let's do that. But I want to tell people the website, thesohoforum.org. So go check that out.
Yeah, and the podcast is the Soul Forum Debates podcast. And speaking of podcasts, Tom, before we get launched, I still do want to congratulate you for, in my view, having done the podcast that was probably the best source of information on the lockdowns. Here's the funny part. Every once in a while, you keep apologizing for your obsession with the lockdowns. But I think you shouldn't apologize at all, Tom. It was by far the other podcasters should apologize for not covering it enough.
Yes, correct. That's right.
Yeah, Tom. Yeah, I'm trying to light a fire under you there. And so we can't leave this subject alone, Tom. It was the most awful event of our time. I liked Dave Smith's joke, which is, hey, the government isn't totalitarian. By the way, I called the mayor to ask if it's okay if I go outside this morning.
Yeah.
And that was good. Yeah. And you've had. I recommend to people that if you want to get a good review of the lockdowns, Tom you had 2 interviews. I think with Jay Bhattacharya. You had about 3 with Ivor Cummins. Those were great interviews. And of course, your quiz. And that data, I've sent that around to a lot of people. I mean, I would build on it and say only that, what does that quiz show? It shows that you can't make any sense of the effectiveness of the lockdowns, that there's no way to show on the basis of the raw data that the lockdowns made any difference. And the real challenge is, build your multivariate model, you people out there who believe the lockdowns made any difference. Build your 9-variable multivariate model to explain why Florida did okay compared to California, all the rest of it. If you can explain all that, that's fine. That's the challenge that Tom Woods issues to you. I think you need at least 9 variables in your multivariate model, but I doubt that you can explain why one area of the country with practically no lockdown did just as well as areas of the country with pretty intense lockdowns. So that really is, I think, the greatest blast to the layman about why the lockdowns made no difference. And I've said that Fauci and others ought to take it as well. And so again, I congratulate you, Tom, for all that you've done, and I encourage you to continue to comment on what's been going on with respect to the lockdowns.
I appreciate that very much. I'll just add a couple quick things. Yeah. According to the CDC's own data, Florida, when you look at it in terms of age-adjusted COVID mortality, is all the way down at number 41. Yeah. So, I mean, that's like one of the best states in terms of performance, one of the best. That's incredible. That nobody in March 2020 would have predicted that would be the result. And now that it is the result, they claim that they can account for it because of X, Y, and Z. They're full of it. If I had said that to them in March 2020, that Florida, by ignoring all this, will be all the way down at 41 in terms of age-adjusted COVID mortality, they would have laughed at me.
Well, I agree with you, Tom, but I would bring it to another level. We call it multivariate analysis, that you have to control for all the variables in order to explain what happened. And so, again, my challenge is explain it with your multivariate analysis.
Yeah, show us.
Climate, throw in anything that makes reasonable amount of sense and show us. And obviously, they're not taking us up on it. And of course, you've been assiduous in quoting, what's his name, the guy who's been studying viruses, I forget his name, the guy who conceded that you can't explain Idaho. Was it?
Michael Osterholm. Yeah, you can't explain Iowa.
Yeah, and by the way, in terms of being hopeful, I have argued, and of course I'm often wrong, that now that they brought Trump down and they are, and the localities really are a bit concerned about the tax base, and so the wind is blowing in the other direction. They really do want to, at least in this country, they do want to open up. Again, I heard Fauci be interviewed on PBS just the other day, and the interview was pushing him to declare that there could be more lockdowns, and he was backing away from that. He said, if you've been vaxxed, you don't need a mask, you don't need to wear a mask. He kept emphasizing that. So I think that, Fauci, of course, always knows where the wind is blowing. He's a politician.
Yeah.
So I'm hopeful that they'll open up the economy and this won't come back. But meanwhile, you and I have to be eternally vigilant, and of course you especially, Tom, to make sure that we understand what went on. And that's where you've made an enormous difference and should continue to do so.
Well, I appreciate that very much. I would love to attend the debate featuring my good friend Scott Horton.
Yeah.
It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's just that, as I've said, I have 3 events in October, including my 2000th episode. So it's logistically impossible.
And I want to say to people about that 2000th episode, you owe it to yourself to ask, do I have a wedding to go to on October 16th? Okay. Do I have a funeral of a friend? Do I have to go to my own funeral? Those are 2 or 3 good excuses.
Do I have to go to my own funeral?
Then that's a good excuse.
Then you're excused.
And you're excused. Or alternatively, okay, now this gets personal. Or alternatively, did you get the news last week that your grandson is being bar mitzvah on October 16th?
I know, Gene. That just breaks my heart.
That's the news I got last week. So between going to Tom's bar mitzvah and on this 2000s, or my grandson's, I unfortunately have no choice. And now it can be told that Tom would force me to be a chronic liar. How was that? Because Tom honored me by saying, I want you as a mystery guest, a surprise guest. So Tom said, and keep your fat trap closed about.
I didn't put it quite that way, Gene.
I knew you did. Okay, but then what happened? People were asking me, "Are you going to the 2000s?" So I had to lie. I said, "Oh, I know. I really wish I could. I got a family event." Sometimes they ask me. I said, "A wedding, vaguely," and now it turns out that I do have a family event. However, I will be offering a barn burner of a video, which I'm going to be working on, that will be shown at that event. So that's another reason to attend.
Thank you, Gene.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gene. Sure. Well, let me just say a couple things. So I wanted Gene to be one of the special surprise guests just because I wanted people not to know Gene was coming. Then I announce him, and because it's a surprise and because it's Gene would have gotten the ovation of a lifetime in front of this giant crowd. And that's what I wanted.
Wow.
That's what I wanted to have happen. That was why I wanted to do it. But don't worry, we have several other special surprise guests coming. And one of them is being asked, are you going to the Tom Woods 2000th? And I almost said who it is. I said, oh, Gene, you should do what so-and-so's been doing. I can't say who it is. And this person says that whenever somebody asks him that, he says, I'm traveling.
Yeah, well, traveling.
Which is correct, to the 2000th episode. That's where he's traveling.
Traveling. Okay. God, I offered more percent traveling, but that's not a good excuse. As I say, you got a funeral, a wedding, traveling. Yeah. Anyway, okay, if he gets away with that, that's fine. I said a family obligation, which I didn't elaborate on, which is a good. So Thomas turned liars into all these people because they're probably being asked, but it's very difficult to smoke them out. Anyway, you shouldn't miss the 2000, even though there will be no standing ovation for me at my grandson's bar mitzvah, but that's what I unfortunately have to be.
All right, two little things, then we're going to get into the topic. The first is you said something very kind to me that I have been thinking about ever since when I saw you at PorcFest. You said that whatever else you can say about the Tom Woods Show, it lifts your spirits every day. There's something about that, like if you're in the dumps, it makes you feel better, and if you feel good already, you feel even better after listening to the Tom Woods Show. And that just made me happy. That somebody who's a regular listener feels that way. So I want you to understand that when I say what I'm about to say, I mean it entirely affectionately.
Oh, thanks.
Not in any way making fun of you, but entirely affectionately.
Okay.
Yeah. Here you go. You thought you felt good before you started listening to this episode, but forget it.
Yeah.
But no. What I want to say is everything you and I have said on the episode so far is a result of your response simply to Gene, welcome to the show. That's all I had to say. Generated all this. All right. Okay, let's jump in. Today, I want to talk about the national debt simply because, but because I had somebody, I do a supporting listeners Q&A for people at the higher levels every month. And you should join that, supportinglisteners.com. And I was on it the other night, and somebody said, how about an episode on the consequences of the national debt explained for a layman? And I thought, yeah, that is actually a good topic. So what I want to start off with is it became fashionable, I think, in the 1980s to say deficits don't matter. And that I've heard that attributed to Dick Cheney and I think to maybe a few others. But the point is, now that we're in 2021 and the deficits are huge and the debt, which is the accumulation of the deficits, is huge, it's not clear that people keep warning about it and warning about it and warning about it, but then nothing seems to happen. So does it really have any effect? Maybe these people were right and we just look silly, the way Paul Krugman would say. Explain to a layman why he should be worried.
Well, since you mentioned Krugman, Tom, let me at least file the point that before you guys started doing that great series, Contra Krugman, Krugman was a deficit hawk under George W. Bush. So I just want that filed away for what it's worth, because, Krugman can never be consistent. He basically responds to who's ever in the White House. And so he was a deficit hawk under Bush, for what that's worth. That's not too helpful. Now, of course, Krugman talks about the deficit scolds. And I guess on the face of it, you and I have to concede that we can't point to any problem from this burgeoning debt, even though it's gotten a lot worse. So let me review the data. The exchange rate of the dollar has been holding against other currencies. So that's one thing. That's the fiscal crisis that the Congressional Budget Office keeps predicting. I guess since I mentioned the Congressional Budget Office, I should say that they have been my primary go-to source, because I think that even though they have a Keynesian orientation, they've been basically sound on this issue, basically sound on projecting the numbers. And of course, I like to cite them, especially because they're Keynesians. They are an establishment group. They're very skilled policy wonks, and they keep warning about an impending fiscal crisis from the debt. And so they are unfazed, and they're not exactly, doom and gloom free market Austrians. I'm not a doom and gloomer either, by the way, but I am a free market Austrian. So therefore, there's a reasonable body of opinion that disagrees. The Congressional Budget Office did a recent update. They continue to warn about an impending fiscal crisis because the logic is compelling. And it doesn't daunt me either, the knowledge that you don't see any great signs that the burgeoning debt is disturbing the markets, because I do think that the U.S. economy leads a charmed life. I do think that there are always lots of wild cards in the story. I mean, one of my challenges to people is that, we had two severe recessions in the mid-'70s and the early '80s. Then we had two mild recessions. Then we had a very severe recession, the worst in '08, '09, the worst since the Great Depression. It's very difficult for Austrians to account for the fact that two severe recessions, mid-'70s, early '80s, were followed by two mild recessions. There's all kinds of mysteries in the way in which the resilient U.S. economy works. The other part of it as well is you always have to compare the U.S. economy with other economies. Maybe that's why the dollar is holding. Of course, the other point I have to concede to answer your question is that price inflation continues to be mild. So all that is true. However, it's impossible for any rational person to believe that this will end well. I sent you a quote from former Congressional Budget Office Director Douglas Holtz-Eakin. He said in 2011 that the federal budget is on the road to hell, and that we are experimenting with the idea of acting like a third world country. He said that in 2011, and since then, things have gotten a lot worse. Now let me, I guess, sketch why things have gotten worse and appeal to the reason of rationality of your audience and point out to them that it's very difficult to believe that ultimately, eventually, and it could be 10 to 15 years from now, that the markets will awaken. I should, to back and fill even further, the 10-year, 20-year Treasury bond and note are selling for, 2%, a little less than 2%. And the idea that anybody would accept 2% over a 20-year period sounds bizarre to me. But of course, the explanation perhaps and why there's a calm before the storm is a fact that I just learned this morning, because I'm actually not very good at reading Fed data, and the SIBO doesn't report this. I got in touch with a money market economist who used to work for the Fed. I knew him for 25 years when I was at Barron's. And I sent him a simple question: how much of the increase in debt over the last year or so has the Federal Reserve accounted for? How much of it has the Federal Reserve taken? And he basically told me all of it. The Federal Reserve has increased its holding of treasuries by $4.2 trillion over the last 12 months. And that's actually probably a little bit higher.
Actually, Gene,
Yeah,
let's back up for a second.
Sorry.
I really, really want this to be for the layman.
Oh,
so
sorry.
the Federal Reserve has increased its balance sheet and it's buying treasury. Even that, people don't even know what we're talking about.
Okay.
So take this to, then I want you to dumb it down. And I don't mean to insult the audience, but I know that people want to hear explain. So I want you to take it down a notch. And then when you're about to speak, take it down another notch. So what does this actually mean?
Well, I appreciate, what it means. Well, okay, the implications, I think, are, and what the effect will be, I think, is a little bit.
No. Yeah, that we'll get to. But I want to know, what does that mean for the Fed when you say the Federal Reserve bought a bunch of treasury? Yeah. They don't know what that means. And why does the Federal Reserve do this? Basic. What's going on here?
Well, okay. Thank you, Tom. And indeed, that's a correction to me, because I like to think that I can explain things to the layman.
Yes,
and
you can.
Absolutely. And thank you for pushing me in that direction, Tom. I'll do my best with a little help from my friends, like maybe you.
Okay.
The Federal Reserve has been engaged in something called quantitative easing. The official purpose is to keep interest rates low. And so if you buy bonds and you put buying pressure on bonds, that means then that the price of the bond rises and the difference between the price and the return on the bond narrows. So you add buying pressure and you keep interest rates low, and they've managed. And there's been some debate, by the way, as to whether it's really been effective, but that has been the intent, and it's been true now for a long time. The quantitative easing, they were buying mortgages. They were attempting to keep not just the short-term interest rate low, but by buying long-term bonds, they've been attempting to keep long-term interest rates low. And I guess on the basis of course, the results so far, they have been succeeding in doing so. Now, is that helpful so far? Or
yeah. That's much better.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. And then in addition, what surprised me, however, is that what we call debt held by the public. Debt held by the public includes debt held by private institutions. It includes debt held abroad by the Chinese, by Japan. It includes, of course, debt held by central banks of Japan and China and by other countries. It also, in fact, includes the debt held by the Federal Reserve. The debt held by the public is the figure I prefer. It's the figure used by the Congressional Budget Office. It's now a little bit higher than nominal GDP. It's now about 101% of nominal GDP, to a gross domestic product. But what surprised me is the magnitude of the Fed purchases, that the debt held by the public has grown by a little over $4 trillion over the past year, and the Fed holdings of debt have grown by a little over $4 trillion. Now, what happens, of course, is the Fed tends to buy long-term bonds, so it doesn't necessarily buy the same bonds, the same mix that are issued to the market, but basically what the Fed has acquired, a little over $4 trillion, is about equal to the increase in debt held by the public. And if you take percentages, you have about $21 trillion out there of debt held by the public. And nearly, at this point, nearly 25% of it is now held by the Federal Reserve. About a third, by the way, is held abroad. About $1 trillion of it is held by China. About $1.2 trillion of it is held by Japan. And then a number of other countries hold about a third of it. So you got a quarter of it, and then you got a third of it accounted for. And then the rest is held by U.S. citizens and by private institutions. But the fact that the Fed has accounted for such a huge percentage of it is just off the charts. It's never happened before. The Fed holdings went over the past year from a little less than $1 trillion to now a little over $5 trillion, an increase of about $4.2 trillion. So again, let's stop there. Is that clear so far? Just accounting for what they're holding and where we're heading.
Yeah, it is. It is. And then once you're wherever you're going to rest this, I still have follow-ups.
Okay, I'm sure you do. But now the Congressional Budget Office, actually, oddly, a significant omission in their reporting. I found, even though they do a very good job with their updates of the 10 and 30-year projections. Yeah, they do a 30-year projection and a 10-year projection. And you might ask yourself, how is it possible, since it's difficult to know what exactly is going to happen next year, how is it possible for the Congressional Budget Office to do any kind of plausible projection of what's likely to happen 10, 20, and 30 years from now with respect to the debt? Well, it's plausible that they can do this because so much of the debt consists of elder care entitlements. So they essentially assume a fairly steady state with respect to all of what's called the discretionary spending, so-called defense and other things that the Federal Reserve, that the federal government does. But then they are able to project on the basis of the trends what is happening with respect to Obamacare, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those, and then, of course, the demographic increase in the baby boomers. So they have a plausible projection about what's likely to happen. And, of course, when they say that, as they said recently, that the 101% of GDP it will nearly double in 30 years by 2050 to over 200%. They have a plausible warning about where things are heading. And that's why, again, Douglas Holtz-Eakin said, that our budget is on the road to hell. It's not that this has to happen, but it's only that there's a plausible that it could indeed happen. And then the question, of course, as Douglas Holtz-Eakin asks, is this a way to run a government? Is this proper fiscal planning? And of course it isn't. If there's a real risk that this is happening, and if indeed, by the way, the Congressional Budget Office had originally predicted that we'd get to 101% of GDP by 2034, was actually given their numbers. And so, and what's happened over the last year or two has meant that we've accelerated. They've underestimated it considerably. We're now at 101% of GDP currently. And so, if anything, they're underestimating the threat. And then now you can think, hopefully in simple layman's terms, you have to pay interest on the debt. And there, too, we're leading a charmed life. The interest payments on the debt, the average interest payments on the national debt are still about 1.6 to 1.7% at the moment. And it's actually fallen. The historic average on payments on the debt is 5.8%. As recently as 2005, we were nearly at 5%. So amazingly, even though the debt is burgeoned, the interest rate has come down. So again, you could keep claiming that, so not to worry. Look at all the decent trends. But what the Congressional Budget Office does then is project the possibility that the average interest rate on the debt will rise to 4.4%, which is well below the historic average since World War II of 5.8%. If you go to 4.4%, then 25% of the federal budget is going to be, of spending in the federal budget is going to be accounted for by interest payments alone, and will continue to increase. And so that's why you can analogize this to some, profligate friend of yours who goes more and more deeply into debt, thinks that since the low interest rates are fine, he can continue to borrow, and yet he will ultimately and most likely pay the piper. The interest payments are going to soar. Now, because I could elaborate further then on why that could trigger a fiscal crisis, but maybe let me stop there because perhaps I've gotten a little bit too wonkish in my account.
Well, I think it's, at least from my point of view, it's clear enough where the fiscal crisis would come from if interest payments absorb all that money.
And what would you say? Where would it come from?
In other words, if interest rates ever were to rise substantially, then a major chunk of the U.S. budget now is going to be taken up by interest payments, and that alone becomes a challenge, even without the unfunded liabilities.
Yeah,
I notice in your analysis, in the old days, like in the classical treatment of these sorts of subjects that you would read in Economics 101, one of the concerns about public debt involves so-called crowding out, a crowding out effect. Yeah. And I don't hear so much discussion of that anymore. Now, what is that, and is it something we need to be concerned about?
Well, by the way, I mean, I should say that Paul Samuelson, who sort of like called the tune in those days in his textbook about what was true and what was not, he was the dominant Keynesian. He was quite ambivalent about the debt, because you haven't mentioned we owe it to ourselves, that business, and the crowding out part. He was concerned about that. Now, indeed, I think that crowding out is not necessarily a problem if you have sort of the miracle that the Federal Reserve can buy the debt, can release enough money and credit so that there's plenty to go around. But that leads to a potential problem down the road if interest rates are low. Now, I believe, as I've emphasized, Tom, in differentiating myself from Peter Schiff and David Stockman, that there still are ways in which the market economy is resilient enough to muddle through. And I think that we have to approach our crisis analysis with all due humility and recognize that it's impossible to time when bad things happen. But to get to you again, to focus on the point, the Congressional Budget Office, of course, does mention crowding out because eventually, and now maybe I should I'm about to bring in modern monetary theory. Even the crazies of modern monetary theory, I actually like to call it modern monetary tyranny. They think that you really don't need taxes, you don't need actual borrowing to finance the budget. You can just have the Federal Reserve print the money, which indeed is more or less what's been happening, although they concede that inflation, price inflation, will eventually bite you in the behind. And so they concede that risk. So to answer your question, perhaps excessive length, I believe that once the Federal Reserve begins to get concerned about price inflation, then it has to back off. And then the borrowing, the excessive borrowing of the federal government does indeed crowd out private borrowing. But if you're able to maintain the magic of low interest rates, then the crowding out doesn't happen. But again, you said if interest rates jump, the Congressional Budget Office is only projecting 4.4%, well below the historic average. And they're talking about a real crisis resulting. And so once you get interest rates back to the point where they make a certain amount of sense in terms of risk and expected inflation, then I think the crowding out does occur, but not until then.
Hey everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Policy Genius. You've all heard the word adulting, haven't you? Really annoying word. It basically means doing the minimally responsible things that an adult does, like getting your driver's license renewed or getting an oil change. Well, to me, if that word means anything, it means things like taking care of people who depend on you. And that means getting life insurance. See, with Policy Genius, you can easily compare quotes from over a dozen top insurers all in one place. You can save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius, which in turn means you could save $1,300 or more per year on life insurance by using Policy Genius. The licensed experts at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance companies, so you can trust them to help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. And eligible applicants can get covered in as little as a week, thanks to an award-winning policy option that swaps the standard medical exam requirement for a simple phone call. They never sell your information to other companies. They never add on extra fees. So head over to policygenius.com to get started right now. Policy Genius. When it comes to insurance, it's nice to get it right. You made the analogy to a friend who just keeps getting into more and more debt.
Yeah.
And we know that obviously in the long run, something's got to give there. But when the situation is a government, like the United States, that for better or worse is viewed as a very, very safe haven, then what exactly is it that eventually makes this stop?
Well, okay, you mentioned the safe haven, and that's a little bit of a wild card. Now let me get to the point where I was going to begin to continue to elaborate. I'll tell you another funny story I'm running with Krugman, which was kind of indirect. I did a cover story on this issue for Barron's on this topic, and we had and the cover story, and on the cover of Barron's, it read, picture of Obama, "Stick with me, we can be like Greece." And that's what the cover said. So then Krugman released a little blog saying, all those fanatics at Barron's, and never naming me, they think we're headed the way of Greece. But of course, Greece had to pay its debt in euros and couldn't print euros, whereas we can pay our debt in dollars. Our debt is denominated in dollars, and so it's a not to worry. That's what Krugman said. So I responded with my own little blog post released by Barron's, and I first pointed out that analogy to Greece did not come from me. It came from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. They said, of course, the analogies aren't perfect, but when they reviewed the potential for a fiscal crisis, they pointed out that there was a potential analogy with Greece. So he can accuse the Congressional Budget Office of being alarmist, even though for the most part, he respected the Congressional Budget Office. But that aside, to get to your question, of course, it's not just that we are a potential safe haven. It is indeed that our debt is denominated in dollars. And so, strictly speaking, since we can print any number of dollars, we will never default. But the default will likely occur through the excessive printing of dollars, which would cause price inflation, and which would mean, of course, that the value of those dollars will decline. Now, what am I doing in this case? What I'm doing in this case is echoing the Congressional Budget Office by saying that we should worry about the exchange rate on the dollar. It won't necessarily hold. We won't necessarily be the safe haven of the world if our debt is more than 200% of gross domestic product. Furthermore, the idea that the printing of money doesn't trigger price inflation, that seems to be a little bit absurd. We do, and we to some degree can account for the fact that the printing of money has not yet caused price inflation, but still it's a worry. So that the likely response on the part of the Federal Reserve, and Greenspan actually has written about that, the pressure on the Federal Reserve to print money in order to take the heat off the incredible fiscal burden that the federal government will be facing, that pressure will be pretty intense. And certainly at this point, it's pretty clear that Chairman Powell, the current Fed chairman, is quite willing to print money. And so that's the risk we face. But then you say, hey, won't we continue to be, but compared to what? Won't we continue to be the safe haven of the world? And if we are going to continue to be the safe haven of the world, maybe we can get by with a 210% of GDP debt, and maybe we can continue to print money and get away with it. And I have to say, I imagine you have to say as well, Tom, well, maybe, but is this the way you want to run the government's fiscal affairs? Is this responsible? And that's why, he can say it's on the road to hell. We're acting like a third world country, although he doesn't necessarily predict the outcome. He just points out there's a real risk, just like the Congressional Budget Office points out, there's a real risk that this will end very badly for the budget. So I'm not sure that sufficiently answers your question, Tom. Because go ahead.
Let me follow up with one more thing.
Sure.
About the average person. Let's suppose I'm the average person. I don't receive many government transfers, or let's say I'm somebody who's really provided for myself, and I don't really need the government transfer programs, even the big ones.
Yeah.
So if there's a fiscal crisis, well, that's the government's problem, but it's not really mine.
Oh.
Is there a way that the debt spills over and becomes my problem and not just a government budget problem?
Oh, yes. Okay. Sure, Tom. Well, number one, I now have a good excuse now to elaborate on what I meant by modern monetary tyranny, my little parody of modern monetary theory, because they say, you can really get away with printing money. You don't have to raise it through taxes or borrowing. That's, of course, the hidden tax that this hypothetical person, you or me, Tom, who doesn't rely necessarily, although I'm getting some Social Security, I am taking it, it's true. But, these people you mentioned, who are indeed numerous, who don't depend on government largesse, at least not at this stage in their lives, they are paying a hidden tax. That's what happens when the Federal Reserve prints money rather than and finances government spending through the printing of money rather than through taxing and borrowing. Through taxing and borrowing, at least you know what they're taking from you. But when they print money, they're basically assuming command over resources that you might otherwise be able to buy, but they're taking it for themselves. So you're actually feeling that, even though you don't know it. But then now, to get to the drift of your question, Tom, the fiscal crisis will affect us all. The fiscal crisis will mean now to back up and elaborate on it again, the most likely reaction will be, if it ends badly, will be the rampant printing of money and the rise of price inflation. The rise in price inflation back to where it was in the 1970s, where it was exceeding double digits. And so that's going to pinch that person whom you mentioned. The other part of it will be the potential for a collapse in the dollar, which could mean a Dow dollar death spiral, that all of the massive holdings on the part of foreigners in our stock markets and in our bond markets could mean that if the dollar starts to collapse, they will start to bail. So our financial markets could suffer. And that could have spillover effects to that hypothetical person you mention. And then there could be a spike in interest rates that would cause a recession. So all of those bad things are definitely going to impinge on the person whom you mentioned, who doesn't depend on those transfer payments from the federal government. The most plausible, again, just to revert to the first part of it, is that the money expansion that could be the reaction on the part of the Federal Reserve to help the federal government pay its enormous bills could indeed, even the modern monetary theorists concede, it could lead to spiraling inflation, and that will definitely impede the life of that person you mentioned.
All right, excellent. Well, Gene, I want to rest it there unless there's anything urgent that you feel like is missing from this painting that you've done for us here.
I guess not. Yeah, you've given me every opportunity to go into. I'm looking at my notes, and well, I mean, of course, let me mention that what's interesting about the foreign holdings, that old idea we owe it to ourselves. 1/3 of the debt is held abroad. So we don't owe it to ourselves. We owe 2/3 of it to ourselves, even though, of course, the owe it to ourselves for those 2/3 is an absurdity. But at least it's clear on the face of it that if 1/3 is held by foreigners, then we don't owe it to ourselves. The Chinese have actually stopped accumulating debt. I don't know whether they can where that will head in the future. They do own more than $1 trillion of it still. And there was a great joke told by a fiscal hawk that if we ever go to war with the Chinese, we'll have to finance it, at least in part, with money that we borrow from the Chinese. So that could be a good part of it. And then, come to think of it, Tom, I also wanted to mention a potential silver lining. The only way, as far as I can see, that Bitcoin or indeed gold could ever become adopted as money, and that would be a good outcome if it were, is that the dollar is going to become unstable. And so the silver lining potentially is that if the dollar does become unstable in terms of the exchange rate, in terms of the price inflation, then it could be an opportunity for us to turn to a more stable money, perhaps Bitcoin, perhaps gold. So at least that's a minor silver lining in this depressing scenario.
Wow. Well, thank you, Gene, for doing this.
Sure.
This was just what the doctor ordered.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. I want to, of course, so the show notes page, tomwoods.com/1932. I don't know if we're going to have anything on there. If there are any articles or anything that you think would supplement this, send them. Just email them to me if you think of any.
Okay, sure.
But also I'm going to have the link to the Soho Forum up there.
Thanks.
Not only because I want people to attend your events, and particularly the Scott Horton event,
yeah,
but also because if just on the off chance there happens to be somebody in New York who may have a solution to your venue problem.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe they can contact one of us and we can see if it's a fit.
I appreciate that, Tom. And again, I can say now, I can commit myself, free drink at the bar at the Scott Horton debate afterwards, if you just say the words, Tom Woods.
Easiest drink you ever earned, everybody. All you got to do is say Tom Woods. And I've done it myself. I've gone up to Gene and said the name Tom Woods. Tom has collected big time. And that old, what's that charming daughter of yours, the oldest one? She laid it on. Regina also said Tom Woods.
Regina, she got a soft drink. No hard stuff for her, but she appreciated her soft drink. And the Soul Forum Debates podcast, to go into all our previous podcasts. And I did invite Tom Woods to debate a particular issue, but Tom's got other fish to fry. He's taking on a massive commitment, and so I forgive him. I'll fall back on some other people to debate the issue of the lockdowns.
Yeah, but I will be back in the game in the relatively near future.
Well, that's good to hear, Tom. I'll take you up on that. All right.
Okay.
Talk to you soon, Tom.
Thank you, Gene.
Oh,
All right, folks, that's our episode. If you like and appreciate The Tom Woods Show, and really, why wouldn't you? Then become a supporting listener and join the Tom Woods Show elite at supportinglisteners.com. Among many, many other goodies, you get to attend a free exclusive reception at the 2000th episode event in Orlando, October 16th. Only supporting listeners can attend that, and I'll be mingling and meeting as many people as possible. It's going to be a great event, but you get many, many goodies, including membership in the elite. So check that out at supportinglisteners.com. I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.